I've come to tell you what I see. There are great darknesses.
You kill me, bitch. That's the joke of all time.
Keep away from the windows. Somebody might blow you a kiss.
Silencio. Silencio.
Don't you like the taste of blood?
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale.
I shall now count from 1 to 10.
We're gonna get done, dude!
Godzilla!
He hates these cans!
Because he's here!
Welcome to the Church of Cinematic Oblivion. I'm Nick.
And I'm Harry, and today we are asking a couple important questions.
The main question is, how do you watch Burst City?
But to understand how to watch that particular movie, you have to understand how to watch a couple other movies to get into it.
Yeah, you see, here's where this whole episode originated from. Harry and I meant to do an episode about the film Burst City by Sogo Ishii, but by the end of it, even though we loved the first two-thirds of the film, we were left feeling a little bit perplexed and a little bit frustrated. And rather than just write the movie off because we had enjoyed parts of it, we started to ask ourselves the question, did we watch this movie the right way, or are you even meant to watch this movie at all?
Yeah, and then this is when you ask the question of experimental films, and you show someone an experimental movie like Wavelength, the question you get a lot is, am I really expected to sit through this? And maybe the answer isn't always yes.
I think the answer is, no, not exactly. That's because experimental film, by its very nature, shouldn't ask the same of the viewer as it asks of the film, right? Because when we see an experimental film, it's not fitting our standard expectations of a movie we'd go to the movies to watch. And so we have to ask, should we go to the movies to watch a movie like this?
Yeah.
So we're going to explain how we feel about that question in 3 chapters. The first chapter asks the question, how do you watch an experimental film? Okay, so experimental film has existed about as long as film has existed. In fact, probably the first films ever made were the Thomas Edison Monkey Shine films, which were just experimental in the sense that they were experimenting with how the camera worked.
Right, experimental doesn't necessarily mean plotless or avant-garde. Avant-garde is kind of a different term, which is really what we're talking about. So we could start off with the French surrealists in the 1920s. Making movies like The Return to Reason, which is by Man Ray from 1923, or Anemic Cinema by Marcel Duchamp. These are movies that are just showing you kind of flashes of fragments of images. They're not even showing you full scenes. In The Return to Reason, you have like shapes falling down a panel, close-up of hands, a close-up of a woman's breasts. Anemic Cinema is just kind of shapes moving in front of the thing. There are like screws and springs rolling around. It's purely for the sake of creating a visual language.
And before sound cinema existed, there was this kind of idealistic concept shared by a lot of filmmakers internationally that film could be a language that transcended what literature had been, and even what theater had been, in that it was based in dialogue and that it was based in language and speech in general. And there were several movements throughout the early days of film that basically tried to show that film didn't have to conform to traditional narratives. There was the cinema pur movement in France, and there were films, of course, most famously like Un Chien Andalou, that decided that film could be more like a recreation of a dream and dream images than a traditional novel-like story.
Right, and Un Chien Andalou is the most famous and by many considered one of the first true avant-garde experimental films, and it took a lot of what Man Ray and Duchamp were doing with his early movies, but instead of just having visuals, it created scenarios, and they were outlandish, unrealistic dream scenarios, but they still were scenarios with characters interacting in, a scene.
Right. Now, these conceits existed later into the history of film. Of course, in the silent era, that was easy, because to create experimental images before it was really clear that film was going to be a narrative art form was actually pretty acceptable. I mean, it was kind of like there were two camps. Does the film follow a narrative, or does the film just kind of display images and dreamlike sequences, or maybe even abstract sequences like the films you were talking about?
Yeah, and the question of how you watch these movies, well, these are movies that you would sit and take in at one piece, because The Return to Reason is like maybe 2 minutes long. I think Anemic Cinema is about 3 minutes. Un Chien Andalou is 15, so it's a little bit longer, but they're very watchable.
However, the fact of the matter is that in the 20s and 30s, when a lot of these films were made and when a lot of experiments were being done, cinemas or picture houses were kind of a place you would just walk into. Mm-hmm. Like, the idea of starting a movie from the beginning and watching it to the end, sure, some people did it, but there was very much a culture of, hey, we're drunk, let's go to the picture house.
Well, Andre Breton, he invented his concept of what an experimental film was. From he and Robert Desnos would get drunk and they'd go to the picture house and they'd go from one theater to another, and they would get like what they considered in his head one movie, which are just chunks of 4 different movies. And to him, that was a surrealist narrative.
Right. And, you know, that's interesting because not everybody watches films like we watch films. And maybe that was how we approached this film the wrong way, because with experimental film, the films we're talking about, there are plenty of those movies that I love, but I don't sit, turn the lights off, tell everyone to get off their phones, tell everyone to shut up, and watch them. Mm-hmm. I put them on, people are hanging out, people are talking, the movie's flashing up on the screen, or you can project it on the wall, and it feels real cool. And films like that, let's get a little later into the experimental era. In the 40s, a woman who's well-known in film history named Maya Deren made a film called Meshes of the Afternoon.
Right.
That really cemented the idea that if you make a movie, it doesn't really have to like feel like a Once Upon a Time and Happily Ever After, beginning to end kind of thing. It can just sort of be, hey, this is sort of what it feels like to be having a dream or having a nightmare.
Well, the difference with Meshes of the Afternoon as opposed to The Return to Reason or Anemic Cinema is that Meshes of the Afternoon has a real cohesive, it has a real cohesive language to it. Every visual leads to the next visual, leads to the next visual, it does have a story. It's just a nonsensical surrealist story.
It's a story about death and about reflection and about identity, but it's mostly just like kind of a dream symbol image play.
But what I mean is the visual language transcends the whole thing. Visuals that you see at the beginning of the movie come up in important ways near the end of the movie. So it is, as much as it is non-linear, it still is a cohesive whole.
That's right. Later on, let's talk about the 60s. Well, actually, in the same era as Maya Deren, a guy named Kenneth Anger started to make some early experimental films that didn't get a lot of recognition. Mm-hmm. Like when he was 10 years old, he made a movie called Ferdinand the Bold that's lost forever. And in the 40s, later on, when he would have been young and a teenager, he made Tinsel Tree, which was a film about a Christmas tree. And then most notably, as you said, when he was, I think, 18?
When he was 18, he got arrested for making a movie called Fireworks.
Okay.
Which was about just homoerotic movie about sailors torturing other sailors in a sadomasochistic way. But his most famous movie in the early 60s is probably Scorpio Rising.
Fools rush in where angels fear to tread, and so I come to you, my love, my heart above my head.
That's right. And Scorpio Rising, I feel like, is the most direct influence on Burst City.
Yeah,
we'll
so
be discussing.
Scorpio Rising is a movie that is just sequences of a lifestyle. Unlike Meshes of the Afternoon, you don't have to pay attention to certain images that are going to play back. There is no overarching theme or running visual language. Scorpio Rising is just it's you watching a party, essentially, and you stepping into this subculture. This is really, in my opinion, the first movie that doesn't demand to be watched in the traditional sense.
Right.
It demands to be observed passively. Maybe put on in the background, maybe you walk in while it's playing in a museum and you walk out before it's over.
Yeah. I completely agree, because I would put it on at parties. I would just put Scorpio Rising on in the background, and it would be all this awesome old 60s and 50s music and images of like really, really, like leathered up dudes working on their motorcycles and then having a big sex party.
Yeah. And we, of course, because you and me are movie snobs, we have sat down and watched these movies with headphones and listened to the actual audio. But like Scorpio Rising's, it's 15 minutes, 20 minutes maybe?
No, it's 30.
It's 30 minutes?
Yeah,
okay, well, I enjoyed it. I watched it and I wasn't bored, but I don't know if I could ever traditionally watch a movie like Wavelength.
And what we discovered is that we couldn't traditionally watch a movie like Burst City for the whole 2 hours.
Yeah.
For about 90 minutes we were into it, and then the last half hour pissed us off.
Right.
And there's other films that fit that bill that I love them when I put them on and they've meant so much to me in those moments, but not when I've tried to actually sit down and watch them. And one example of that is Dog Star Man by Stan Brakhage.
Right. So Dog Star Man was originally 5 short films, and the films were each about 15, 20 minutes long, and it literally is as abstract as you can get. It is shots that are so close up that you can't tell what they are, or they're overlaid with 3 other shots, or they're in negative, or in some cases he's literally painting directly onto the film print itself.
And the game of the movie is that there is no soundtrack whatsoever, unlike
It's
Scorpio
just
Rising.
silent. You're just supposed to listen to the reel in the projector turning.
Yeah, but we don't even have that. So
Right.
our game was always sync up an album with Dog Star Man and see what works best.
Right. So I've watched Dog Star Man. The 5 short films have been put together into one full-length film, which is about 80 minutes long, and I've watched it with Pink Floyd synced up. But even that, watching the whole thing in one sitting with music, is not really watching it the way it's supposed to be watched. Because if you watch it the way it's supposed to be watched, there would be nothing. You would be sitting in a silent room looking at silence for 80 minutes.
Because obviously the point of the movie is it starts with these images where you don't even know what you're looking at. It's color. It feels like you're watching like the birth or death of a universe, and then slowly the image of a man and a dog and stars starts to emerge.
But like barely.
And so it starts to be like what we've discussed before, where it's like meaninglessness slowly evolves into meaning, but barely. And by the time you arrive at the image of a man walking with a dog through snowy mountains, you're like, oh my God, something familiar.
Yeah.
You know?
And even you and I, who we said are film snobs enough to sit through Kenneth Anger movies, we, I don't think, have either watched Dog Star Man the whole way through with silence.
Oh, never.
Yeah.
No, I always put on music. I mean, because it fits any music you put on. It's my party background movie.
Yeah, it's great for hanging out.
Yeah. I mean, it can be a little off-putting, but still, I think it's quite good. And lastly, to keep things Japanese, because we're about to talk about a Japanese experimental film, a filmmaker in the 80s started to follow this tradition named Takashi Ito. He actually started in the late 70s.
Yeah, he's been around. He's still around today. So I just showed Nick this movie called Thunder from 1982. It's a 5-minute
awesome.
film by Takashi Ito. It's just pure video art or film art in that regard, where he's taking the film reel and he's cutting them over each other and editing them in an artistic way and kind of creating this flashing stop motion.
Yeah.
And it's only 5 minutes, and we watched it. The sound, he takes a lot of care to edit the sound as well, so it is more of a full audiovisual experience, and I find it completely captivating and entertaining.
I agree. It's immersive as fuck.
Our dad and Nora didn't quite agree.
No.
They weren't totally on board, but I thought it's great, and I think all of his movies are great, and I think he had a very direct influence on cyberpunk, Japanese cyberpunk, which we'll be talking about next.
But once again, I didn't treat it like a movie. I treated it like I was just going to get immersed in like a weird feeling. Like it was more like when you stare at like one of those magic eye optical illusions.
Well, it's not a narrative film. It's an aesthetic film.
It's like when you stare at a picture that's like, do you see the young woman or the old lady? Do you see the duck or the rabbit? I just was looking and letting my brain kind of go like, whoa. It's like is the dress blue or is it gold and white? You know, and so those experimental films have more of a fun effect on your brain, and that's the fun of them. It's just kind of staring at them and seeing what happens to your brain.
But I also think that movies like Thunder and other Takashi Ito movies are also a genuine artistic experience that can be moving and can be powerful, and they can be more than just a novelty.
And so Takashi Ito demonstrates that Japan has also always been interested in making films that just kind of are aesthetic expressions without a narrative.
Mm-hmm. And we've always talked about how much we love Japanese aesthetics and style. So why don't we move on to an 80s trend in Japanese sci-fi.
So, Chapter 2.
Cyberpunk versus Japanese cyberpunk.
Kevin Flynn, computer genius. Taken prisoner and held captive within the digital world of the computer itself. Trapped inside an electronic arena where love and escape do not compute.
Okay, so American cyberpunk, or I guess Western cyberpunk, kind of came about in the late 70s and 80s, specifically with the writing of William Gibson, sci-fi author.
Yeah, I mean, the film Tron came out in 82, which was all about going into a computer world. It was basically The Wizard of Oz in a computer world. And then also Blade Runner came out that year, which was based on a book from 68 called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And Blade Runner isn't about going into cyberspace, but it does have the kind of gritty city, high-tech, lowbrow look to it.
Yeah, so the aesthetic of cyberpunk is, I mean, punk. It comes out of the 80s when punk was around, and it's the idea of in a far future when we all live in a world where we can enter computers, where we have cyberspace, and people use that cyberspace for hacking and crime and for low-life activities.
Right. And the pinnacle of that came 2 years after Tron, 2 years after Blade Runner, with Neuromancer, written by William Gibson, which is a very hard-to-understand book. I read it recently again, and the first time I read it, I barely understood it. But it basically is about existing in a cyberspace. The more accessible version of this was made in the late 90s with The Matrix. The Matrix is like a gross simplification of the ideas Neuromancer was getting.
Right, which same with 95's Ghost in the Shell is similar ideas about life on the
way
internet.
Better. And Ghost in, well, I was going to we'll get to that. And then there was also Snow Crash in 92. But even the Japanese understood the concepts of cyberpunk because Ghost in the Shell, which was a manga written from 89 to 90 about an artificial intelligence that arises out of the ether of the internet and starts hacking humans' brains. So it's like the reverse. It's like instead of humans hacking computers, a computer is hacking human brains.
Right, so that concept, that sci-fi concept is what cyberpunk is built on. Now, Japanese cyberpunk, which came around in 82, which we'll get to next, is just the aesthetics of cyberpunk. It takes the aesthetics, it takes the punks living in somewhat dystopian low-life conditions, but the actual content of the stories or the visuals are completely far away from cyber.
It's really just Japanese... it's more like Japanese diesel punk.
Well, when we're going to talk about the pinnacle of Japanese cyberpunk is a movie called Tetsuo the Iron Man,
right,
which is really like industrial punk or diesel punk.
It's like industrial body horror.
Yeah, it is. It's very much body horror.
It's about a guy who gets hit by a car and then turns into a machine.
Yeah. Japanese cyberpunk started in 1982 with this movie, Burst City, by Shogo Ichi. It then kind of became a mini trend in Japan, and Burst City directly influenced the 1989 movie Tetsuo the Iron Man, which is considered the pinnacle of cyberpunk, by Shinya Tsukamoto. Shinya Tsukamoto would go on to make movies like Tokyo Fist, Tetsuo 2, Snake of June. He really perfected what is Japanese cyberpunk, which is defined almost entirely in style. It's these flashing stop-motion images, sped-up film, crazy industrial horror show, really creative editing, creative emphatic editing, very like postmodern for the time. And that would get copied by a lot of other directors. Shogo Ishii would make Burst City, which inspired Tetsuo the Iron Man. Then he would later go on to make a movie called Electric Dragon 800,000 Volts, which is very much a ripoff of Tetsuo the Iron Man.
80,000 volts, yeah.
So he inspired someone and then ripped off the person he inspired, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
So this was a trend from like 82 to the early 90s. 95 is when Electric Dragon 80,000 Volts came out. And then there were a couple late era cyberpunk movies. This movie called Pinocchio 265. Rubber's Lover.
Yeah.
And those are kind of when the genre died in the late 90s.
What? I wanted to see those. Are they not
I've seen
good?
Rubber's Lover. It's pretty unremarkable.
Anyway,
it's nothing compared to a Shinya Tsukamoto movie.
The thing that's really interesting about these films is, especially when I think about stuff like A Snake of June and all that, and Burst City, is that the music video as we know it, and in this era we're so familiar with music videos. If you grew up watching MTV2, or if you have YouTube and watch those that come out on the internet every other day, music videos are such a language that we understand. In fact, the language of music videos has translated backwards into almost all Hollywood films that we see today. However, cyberpunk and specifically Japanese cyberpunk, was at the forefront of this early 80s move to make films that were just about showcasing music. And were just about showcasing musical aesthetics. You know?
Yeah, and the aesthetics of the punk subculture is really what it comes down to. That really is what Burst City's about, which we'll talk about in a moment. I do want to say that I really hope that we can do a Shinya Tsukamoto episode at some point, because he is one of my favorite directors, and Tetsuo the Iron Man is one of the most perfectly aesthetic films that I've ever seen. Which
What you have to understand about the characters in this film, the settings in this film, and the way that the costumes look is that it's much more like Mad Max or something like that than it is like William Gibson's Neuromancer or Tron or The Matrix.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more like a Jack Hill film, like Pit Stop or even like Rebel Without a Cause, where it's all about capitalizing on this youth culture, on this car culture, and that kind of look more than anything else. It's more about this kind of Japanese reclamation of American greaser culture happening in the 80s just like it was happening in America.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
But along with the high, frenetic, fast-paced kind of punk aesthetics that were prevalent in the early 80s. Okay, so why don't we ask the big question with Chapter 3. How do you watch Burst City?
So let's start. When we turn this film on, it comes on in the mood of a band setting up to start a show, right? So you feel like you've just gotten to a concert and you're waiting for the beginning.
Well, hold on. No, it starts with these shots going through tunnels on the street and lights passing you by and some amazing sound editing. And I remember I wrote my first note that I wrote down is incredible sound editing / opening. Gorgeous, and it is purely back to what we were talking about earlier with experimental film. It looks like a Takashi Ito movie. It's so zoomed in that it's out of focus and the lights are flashing by blurry and leaving trails. It is purely an aesthetic intro.
Yeah.
And it really sets an amazing tone, and you feel like it's going to be a movie with incredible style.
You feel like it's going to be almost like Takashi Ito, just like an immersive visual experience that is just pulling you into just the sounds and the sights.
Yeah.
Without anything else going on. But then it starts to kind of like goad you with these little hints of narrative. In fact, at the beginning, they sing a song about their city, like "Life of Abundance, we're so bored." And Harry even said, like, this is like in our fair Verona where I set our scene. Mm-hmm. That's giving the movie way too much credit for setting up a story.
Well, also, when that part started where they all start singing and dancing, I'm like, oh, this is a musical? But then there were never any other musical sequences throughout the movie.
No.
Well, we should have set up what the movie is. I didn't realize this until afterwards, but the three main gangs in the movie, the Rockers, the Roosters, and the Stalins, were actual punk bands in Japan. So they got like popular punk bands to come together, and that kind of explains what the movie is more. Right. It's more like a concert film.
It would be like if it was the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, and the Clash all like in a movie together.
Right, just kind of playing music and then having little interactions. Because that's what the movie is. We get a concert in the opening scene, and then we get a couple bits of dialogue, and then we get a drag race. And I remember saying 20 minutes in, I'm like, we've had some really good phantasmagoric music video sequences, but like, we haven't met any of these characters yet. They're kind of just wandering around.
And we kept saying to each other, like, are we supposed to be trying to follow anything here?
Yeah.
And that was what got frustrating over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, 30 minutes in, we realize, okay, this is just an aesthetic movie.
It's just, just
and
stop trying to
we
follow
are loving the aesthetics.
Yeah, totally.
We're really into the style. We're really into the editing. We're really into the look of the whole thing. We love the music, too. But every time we try to keep track of a character or try to follow a plot line, we're getting frustrated. Our attempts to actually watch the movie are making it more frustrating than if we just left it on in the background.
Because maybe narrative is comforting.
Yeah, and also this isn't a movie that's meant to be watched that way.
That's the idea. And what we started to realize is it was scenes after scenes of these bands just living life. Mm-hmm. And it was that like a music video in that sense, like a surveillance camera in that sense, just in the sense that you were seeing how they lived their life in this kind of boring detail. You know what I mean? But it was cool to just see like a punk crash pad, a punk getting in a fight with his boss.
But there also were surrealist elements in those scenes
too. There was one punk who always had this kind of doe-eyed look on his face. In fact, the plot that we didn't pick up on until after we saw the movie is that apparently in the middle of this diesel punk world, a nuclear power plant is being built, and one of the young PTSD-looking punks sees an image of the apocalypse in that being built on their territory. And there's one sequence where it zooms into his eye as he's having one of his PTSD episodes, and it goes on a total Dog Star Man Stan Brakhage interlude.
Yeah, and that part was great. And so much of this movie was so interesting and entertaining just on an aesthetic journey. And we were getting frustrated by following the plot, but we're also like started to kind of accept it as just an aesthetic film, which is why we shouldn't have been trying to watch it so hard.
Right. So it got us pretty far. The film's pretty pleasing aesthetically. There are scenes of near the end and near the begin, like sort of near like the end of the first act, and then also at the end, there's like a horrifying rape murder scene that kind of comes
which
out
is
of
kind
nowhere.
of really off-putting and not part of
And
the
it just suddenly, like, the whole movie becomes this, like, dark blood nightmare.
Yeah.
And then after that, we're like, okay, we need some sort of resolution. But instead of having sort of some sort of explanation for that violence or some sort of resolution to that violence, you just get a sequence where the cops break up a punk show, and then it is literally, and this is where the movie pissed us off, 30 minutes of cops fighting punks.
Cops fighting punks, and like every now and then we'll get one character say something dramatic and it'll go slow-mo. But it's like you've lost our interest. It's a and literally if the movie had ended before that sequence, we would have loved it. It would have been a great movie.
That's what pissed us off.
It just it was already a 2-hour movie, and the last half an hour of that movie is the same thing for 30 minutes, and it's so incredibly frustrating because we really wanted to love this movie.
And I think that's what I realized a day or two later, is that our natural feeling was, okay, there was some sort of basic skeleton of a story going on with punks not being able to exist in Japanese society, with punks being mad about a nuclear power plant, with punks getting fired from their auto shop jobs, and punks punching cops in the middle of the night and stuff like that. And then when the film degraded into concert film, followed by police riot for 30 minutes, you're kind of supposed to just like, and like walk away and just sort of feel the feeling of a riot behind you. So now I want to talk about...
But hold on, because even if you don't try to follow that plot and you just followed it as an aesthetic journey, it's boring to have 30 minutes of the same aesthetics at the end of the film. So even if you forget the plot and just watch it aesthetically, that ending still doesn't work. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other things in the movie that we think are interesting, at least. Like, we loved the music. The lyrics to some of the music. What's the guys working in the car shop? And the song's
like, everywhere I go, I gotta wreck the place. Until the sun comes up, I gotta wreck the place.
One thing about me is that I always do stuff.
Yeah. One thing about me is if a girl's around, I gotta just be annoying and grab her all the time.
Yeah, it's like a ska song. Really fun music, really good concert
Japanese
scenes.
Yeah.
There are also a couple
songs.
moments that are directly influencing Tetsuo the Iron Man and therefore directly establishing Japanese cyberpunk. There's a part where they have a drag race and the cars take off in stop motion.
Yeah.
That idea of doing live action stop motion is something Takashi Ito did, and it becomes the hallmark staple of Tetsuo the Iron Man, and is it what the whole climax of Tetsuo the Iron Man is in stop motion.
Yeah.
Also, there's a part where one of the Stalins is missing his arm, and he just has this skewered metal, fucked up, like prosthetic arm.
Right.
Which is a direct inspiration to the metal in Tetsuo the Iron Man.
I also think that the Widow's Peak tattoo, like sex slave trader, was very reminiscent of villains from like Kuroshige Ichi the Killer, and like later Takashi Miike films.
Yeah.
And like Takashi Miike would follow that kind of gross but weird like aesthetic.
Yeah. So what I think is that Shinya Tsukamoto saw Burst City and took the best elements of it and made a 60-minute movie called Tetsuo the Iron Man, which is just the height of what Burst City is trying to do.
So here's the question, let's answer it and wrap it up. How do you watch Burst City? I said that the best possible way to watch this movie is you're in a dive bar full of mean bartenders attended mostly by bike couriers, and you project it on the wall with the sound full blast all around.
Yeah.
It really feels like the kind of movie you'd put on in a punky bike bar where, not biker, like bike courier, like mechanical bike, punk city couriers, where there's a huge beer menu and the bartenders are really mean.
So we
Zeitgeist. I'm thinking of Zeitgeist in SF.
We had a punk concert at my movie theater recently, and the bands played in front of the screen, and each band had a movie playing behind them. So one band had The Day the Earth Stood Still, the other band had Scanners. I think Burst City would be perfect to project on the wall behind a punk band at a concert.
I think that an alleyway and you put this on a dumpster and people are really cold, but they're all sharing one blanket would be a really good place to play Burst City. Also,
yeah, that's good. I mean, if you put it on in the background of a party and have people walking in and out of the room, hearing moments of the songs or moments of the dialogue, seeing a second of the flashy black and white like nightmare sequences, and then going back to a conversation.
Yeah, just hope no one tries to hook up in front of the movie when the horrible sexual violence scenes start up, because that would throw them. I think that if you were coming down off psychedelic drugs and you were just over,
you would absolutely not want to watch this movie.
You were just over the peak and you were on some stranger's couch and it was the first time you had felt comfortable in 6 hours and the movie was on, you could get lost in it and it would be like...
I think it would ruin your night.
This sort of loud, beautiful dream, you know? You know what I mean? You have any more?
You should show Burst City to your toddlers.
No. It's a frenetic kaleidoscope of a movie, so I guess you could. The last thing I was going to say is if you just wanted, like what I do, I don't work out enough, but the way I used to work out in college was mosh pits, and I miss mosh pits, and I wish I was in them all the time. If you want to invite like 10 of your tough friends over and all like congregate in a big like crowd in the living room, just a huddle, the 10 of you, and then turn on Burst City really loud and then just like mosh for like 20 minutes, that'd be also a good
Sounds
movie.
like a really sad house party you guys are throwing.
Or the best house party ever, man.
Yeah.
So why don't you write to us?
The one thing I will say is don't sit down and watch it and pay attention and try to get a story out of it, because you'll be very frustrated, much like we were.
I think the point we're trying to make is that we are the strictest movie snobs ever about how movies are meant to be watched. We get really mad when people are on their phones. We get really mad when people seem distracted or aren't paying attention. We get really mad when people are talking about stuff other than the movie we're trying to watch. And this is a movie where, you know, if you go into it trying to watch it and pay attention, it's going to piss you off.
Yeah, this movie breaks all of our rules about how to watch a movie.
Right. So it's also changed my perspective on what film means. Narrative film, meant to be watched. Experimental film, meant to be watched.
Sometimes, most of the time.
Sometimes just meant to be like something on the wall.
But here's the thing. I would never know the way this movie is meant to be watched if I hadn't actually watched it first.
Right.
If I went into a bar and it was playing on the wall, I would say, I want to watch that movie, and then I would watch it. So for me, personally at least, I have to at least traditionally watch it first.
Right.
And I will someday watch Wavelength. From beginning to end with headphones in.
I think in the future they should be able to make cheap coasters. First of all, I've watched Wavelength. But I think in the future they should be able to make cheap coasters that are like little iPads. And the coasters each play individual movies. And you could play Burst City on those coasters.
I think that's bad technology.
Yeah, and each person has a Burst City coaster. And just like they can look down through their martini glass and see the Burst City.
Now that's cyberpunk right there.
Right, exactly. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so
if you have an idea of how you think Burst City is meant to be watched, please email us at cinematicoblivion@gmail.com.
Yeah, or if you want any other, if you have any other topics you want us to talk about, if you have any questions for us, please go ahead and send them our way. We'll read your mail on the podcast.
This is a short little episode we were doing between Halloween and Christmas. We had a good Thanksgiving. We didn't want to do Thanksgiving films, so we just decided to watch some Japanese cyberpunk, and we're left with a lot of questions, more questions than answers, really.
Right.
But we wanted to just walk you through our thought process. However, we will be coming back in Christmas and our own personal episode on Inuit films in the Inuit language and films from Inuit society. And, to celebrate the winter season with the Arctic Circle and what it has produced.
So anyway, thank you for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe, and go ahead and follow us on Instagram at cinematicoblivion.com. And we appreciate you listening, as always.
I'm Nick.
I'm Harry.
And we'll see you at Christmas.
Keep watching the screens.